الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at NYU, where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنا هديناه السبيل إما شاكرا وإما كفورا إنا أعتدنا للكافرين سلاسل وأغلالا وسعيرا إن الأبرار يشربون من كأس كان مزاجها كافورا أين يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا يوفون بالنذر ويخافون يوما كان شره مستطيرا ويطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا إنما نطعمكم لوجه الله لا نريد منكم جزاء ولا شكورا إننا نخاف من ربنا يوما عبوسا قمطريرا آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Over the last couple of weeks, we began to take a look at chapter 76 of the Holy Quran, Surah al-Insan. And we said last week that Surah al-Insan, like every chapter of the Holy Quran, has primary objectives and goals that are at the depth of any and every given chapter. Meaning that many a times when we recite Quran, we look at the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we see them almost as random. And we don't understand necessarily why God placed this verse here and why God placed that verse there. So all of a sudden in Surah Al-Baqarah, it talks about the story of Musa alayhi salam, and immediately it transitions into a completely new topic, and you wonder exactly where is this coming from and where are we going. Yet that's not the case. It's important for the believer, for the reciter, for the contemplator of the Holy Quran to recite the chapter and to recite it again and to recite it again until we come to a depth and an understanding of this particular chapter's primary goals and objectives, for undoubtedly they follow a theme, not necessarily is so evident and clear to us at every given moment. But we are told from many of the mufassirin of the Holy Quran that chapter 76, Surah al-Insan, amongst its many goals or objectives, is to remind us, the believer, of our responsibilities and of our potential and of our ultimate purpose in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so from the very first ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِّنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. In these two verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He begins and He places emphasis on getting us to start to think and to start to reflect and to start to contemplate about our purpose and our duties and our responsibilities to the Lord of the worlds. And I want to focus on one particular segment from verse number 2 that we didn't necessarily speak to in detail over the last couple of weeks before we get into the verses for today. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He states, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. And indeed we created man from the drop of a mixed fluid, and we talked about what that means. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, نَبْتَلِيهِ, and we created the human being so that we can try him. And oftentimes people, they get this understanding that the purpose of our existence is so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can test us, and that's all. But if we read the Quran contextually, And if we read the Quran in its entirety, we will quickly see and will quickly realize that it doesn't suffice that the only purpose of our existence is such that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can test us, or such that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can try us. There has to be some deeper wisdom than God creating us so that He can test us. What does God test us for? Isn't there an ultimate objective to a test? But people ask all the time this question: why did God create me? God created you to test you. How does that make any sense? When you go to school, it's final season, you go and you sit in front of your professor and your instructor, and your professor on day one is not going to say that I am going to teach you this class so that I can test you, so I can give you a final exam at the end of the semester. No, the exam is a means to an end. Day one is to speak to the class's goals and objectives. These are the purposes of this class. These are the purposes of this course that you're taking. This is what I'm hoping that you will learn by semester's end. You don't take a class so that you can take an exam. Nor, for instance, do we buy a car to fill it with gas. Nor do we buy a home so that we can pay its mortgage. No, they're all a means to an end. You follow what I'm saying? The car is to take you to the destination that you need to get to. The home is so that you can have a place to live and reside and raise your family and have a sense of security. The course is so that you can benefit in terms of the knowledge that the course is offering. The exam, the fuel, the mortgage are the means toward that ultimate end. Good? So again, then what is the purpose of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating us? And why does He consistently tell us that I am going to test you and that I am going to try you? When we go through any examination in life, be it an examination at work, examination in school, an examination with family members, we get tested all the time. We get our patience tested on a day-to-day basis. All of that is to check to see what the capacity of the human being is in that given instance. Make sense? When you take an exam in class, it's an opportunity for the instructor to assess you, to see where you're at in terms of what you have achieved in terms of knowledge in that given subject matter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts us through tests, and He puts us through these trials. Nabtalihi, that He says in this verse that He will create us and He will put us through tests. And in other verses of the Holy Quran, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ, that we will try you by fear, we will try you by loss, we will try you by lack of food, we will try you by loss of life, we will try you by all of these things. We'll put you through this test. But at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to determine again our capacity. He's trying to determine or hold us to account with regards to what we have learned up until that given moment. And how we respond at every moment of being tested. And we don't know when we're being tested and not, right? We know that we will be tested, but we don't know what is a test for us at any and at every given moment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is judging the barometer of our faith at that given second. So someone says, why, am I going through this difficulty when, I've done everything right and my friend is, making so much money and everything is going right in their life? We often compare ourselves to people in everything, right? We compare ourselves to people in everything, which is a problem. We don't know if that individual who's receiving bounty after bounty, blessing after blessing, paycheck after paycheck, and in financial success or whatever it might be, might actually be tested or tried via their financial success. While the one who is not attaining that financial success could actually be the one who is receiving a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we don't know how we would react if we had that financial success. You follow what I'm saying? We don't know. We don't know. And so we submit. So when we go back to this fundamental and foundational question of what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing us for, or what is the ultimate objective or goal of the test or examination, we can unanimously say, as we can deduce via ayat of the Holy Quran, as well as traditions of the Prophet and of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He puts us through various tests and through various tribulations and through a whole host of trials, some which we know and some which we don't know, some which are apparent and some which are hidden, for the one objective and goal to determine whether or not we truly have increased in our knowledge or of our ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything in our religious tradition comes back to this particular point. Do we know God or do we not know God? And every day, every moment, every second, every year should be one step that we take in unveiling our knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala such that we're able to take our relationship with Him a bit deeper. Awwaluddin, ma'rifatullah. In the words of Ali alayhi salam, the first step of religion is knowing God. And truly the last step of religion is knowing God. Everything in our religion is about coming back toward this fundamental understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And it does not suffice that, for instance, you memorize God's 99 names, or you memorize some ayat of the Holy Quran. I'm not saying these things are bad, they're good and they're noble and have reward to them, whatever. That's fantastic. It does not suffice that we memorize information, but that we apply that which we know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala internally, and then we practice our faith and we live our religion, our Islam, so to say, in a way that continues to cultivate that understanding that we have of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and see how it manifests in terms of our relationships with Him, in terms of our prayers and ritualistic acts of worship, as well as with everyone else. And you see this, for instance, in the life and the legacy of the Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon them. Who knows God better than the Messenger of God, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No one. No one. No one knows. No one has been exposed to the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the same way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has. Yet, we would see that the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, he would be the first one up at night in prayers and in worship and obedience, and he would be the first one out in the day doing whatever he can for community. Because all of that stems from his knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see this in the life and the legacy of Ali and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein and every single one of them. God is consistently at the focal point of their existence. And so it's important for us to always go back to that and understand that God did not create us to test us as the end all be all, ultimate objective of our existence. No, we're not created for examination. Examinations are means to an end. The end is to increase our knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to add to this point before we continue to get into some of these verses as well, is that once we increase that knowledge or that ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, things become very clear for us in terms of how we are to approach the Quran, for instance. Just in the last couple of days, I had a few people meet with me and email correspondence regarding how they should approach the reading or the study of the Quran more broadly. And what happens for many people is that we get fixated on one or two, or three, or a segment of verses of the Quran that might be a bit confusing, and we try to understand and we try to deduce and we try to take out some benefit from them, which is good and which is great and it's wonderful, but oftentimes to the neglect of the rest of the Quran in its entirety. When we take a look at a chapter, like I said before, it's important that we read the chapter from beginning to end, and then we're able to pull out those goals and those objectives of it. Similarly, you can't pull out one chapter of the Quran and remove it from the reading of the rest of the Quran. Meaning that the whole Quran, it commentates on itself numerous times throughout its book. When you don't understand what something means, you continue to read and you're going to find very, very quickly that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will eventually explain or will supplement your understanding of it in another part of the whole Quran. You follow what I'm saying? So for instance, over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse number 3, we talked about this as an example last week. He states, Inna hadaynahu sabil, imma shakiran wa imma kafura. Indeed, we have guided the human being to the right way, to the right path, so to say. be he grateful or ungrateful. And then in the very next verse, God states, إِنَّا أَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ سَلَاسِلَ وَأَغْلَالًا وَسَعِيرًا. What happens to those who are ungrateful? God talks about the punishment, for instance, that they receive. What happens to those who are grateful? إِنَّ الْأَبْرَارَ يَشْرَبُونَ مِنْ كَأْسٍ كَانَ مِزَاجُهَا كَافُورًا. God talks about the reward that they receive. In other words, we want to be able to be someone who, when we're reciting, when we're studying, when we're contemplating upon the verses of the Holy Quran, to again read them in some sense of totality and then make conclusions on that basis. Make sense so far? That's one, or that's two. The third point that I wanted to mention, before again we continue on with these ayat, is that many times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He concludes verses, not any of those which we've recited in the last couple of days, nor what we're going to be reciting today, but He concludes ayat, for instance, with His names or with His attributes. He concludes and He states, Inna Allah sami'an basira. For instance, and He is the all-seeing, the all-hearing, and He is the all-knowledgeable and the all-wise. He is the all-patient and the all-grateful. He is the all-merciful and the all-compassionate. And we often rush through that recitation or that contemplation or that deduction of, because we want to focus on the actual content or the meat of the verse, oftentimes to the neglect of the conversation that speaks to God's names and attributes. You follow what I'm saying? When it's really difficult for us to truly grasp the collective meaning of that verse without understanding what it is that God is trying to tell us and why He's trying to remind us of His names and attributes at that given moment. You follow what I'm saying? So when God concludes the verse by saying, and He is the all-knowledgeable and He is the all-wise, it's important to ask, why is it that God is reminding us that He's the all-knowledgeable and the all-wise at that moment? Why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding me at this given moment that He has knowledge over all things, or that He has inna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir, that He has power over all things? What is it in that verse that I should be looking at that God is speaking to some of His names or attributes in this way? You get what I'm saying? So it's important again to read the verse in its entirety too, and not pull out certain things that we thought were interesting or that were meaningful to the neglect of everything around it. Because when you read it collectively and holistically, the opportunity for us to extract more and get to a deeper understanding is that much more evident. You follow? You get what I'm saying? If you take a class on literature, right, and you read, I don't know, Shakespeare or something, or anything, oftentimes your instructor is gonna pull out one quote, right, from this one line of this one play, and tell you hey, write a whole essay on this, all right, or what does this quote mean to you? We do that all the time. The most important thing to understand is what? Context, right? It's important for us to understand the context. And so what the professor is often looking for the student to do is to be able to deduce something meaningful out of that quote from the context of the play, not just to explain the quote according to your own desire or to your own whim. That doesn't do you any good. We do that all the time, right? We do that often. And again, the Quran is unique in that we believe that the Quran is a living book, that the Quran's benefit impacts us from the day that it was revealed until this very day. But nonetheless, you can't divorce it from its context, again, when we have a context to it, because it gives us that much more meaning. All right? That was point number 4 and number 5, and then we'll get into the verses properly, but I think this is important for me to mention. And I mentioned this, touched on this last week as well, briefly, that when we do have a context to any given verse of the Quran or verses or chapter of the Holy Quran, it doesn't suffice that we only apply it to that context. And the famous example is these verses, which maybe we'll get to today, if time permits, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, يُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ وَيَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا, that they give food out of their love for Allah to the needy and to the orphan and to the prisoner. إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا, saying, they would say, those who give out of their own food to the poor and to the needy and so on, we give this food and we feed others only for the sake of Allah. We don't want any money. We don't want any return. We don't even want a reward from God. We know that this is the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do, and doing it for goodness' sake suffices the fulfillment of my responsibility, undoubtedly and unanimously, that these ayat were revealed, as we'll talk about in a moment, in honor of the Messenger of God, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, along with Ali and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein. There is no doubt that these ayat were revealed in honor of them. But what we often do, and I don't want to get stuck in that, what we often do is speak to the verse in terms of those who were it revealed in honor of and for, and undoubtedly it's an incredible merit, as we will speak to. But we oftentimes don't take a practical lesson from those ayat because we only see it as reserved for Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, which is a problem. What's the purpose of me narrating the story to my children, right? Who know the story, from beginning to end, and they know every detail, and they know how to narrate it because I've said it so many times. What's the benefit if the only thing that they can extract from it is that these ayat were revealed in honor of Ahlul Bayt? Aren't we supposed to act like them, or strive to act like them, or be like them to the best of our capacity? Undoubtedly. Is it in honor of Ahlul Bayt? Yes. Are they the ones who illuminate these ayat and this merit to its most perfect form? Undoubtedly. Can we be as sincere as them? No. Right? That's why Allah has revealed it in honor of them. Asbab al-nuzul, the reason for revelation of these ayat for Ahlul Bayt. Peace and blessings be upon them. But at the end of the day, I can also say, wait a minute. They gave, I can also give. How can I purify my intention such that I give in the same manner that they give, or to the best of my capacity, and so on and so forth? We don't want to be an individual who recites Quran and says this was revealed in honor of this, and it suffices that it's revealed in honor of that. No, I cannot take any lesson. It is not only for these ayat, but many other ayat of the whole Quran as well. So anyhow, let's get into where we left off last week. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He states, إن الأبرار يشربون من كأس كان مزاجها كافورا أين يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا. Last week we talked in verse number 4 about the punishment, and why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishes, and why is it that He holds us to account, and what could that mean? And then we left off by mentioning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then immediately, whenever He speaks about punishment, He speaks about reward. He states, إِنَّ الْأَبْرَارَ يَشْرَبُونَ مِنْ كَأْسٍ كَانَ مِزَاجُهَا كَافُورًا, that surely those who are the righteous, the abrar, they will drink from a cup. And we mentioned that this cup and this drink that they will drink is symbolic of that which is cool and pleasant, and it was language that was utilized amongst the Arabians in the 6th century when these ayat were revealed, that whenever they wanted to speak about a drink that was cool and that would absolve themselves of their thirst, they would state, min ka'sin kana mizajuha kafura. Okay? What is the abrar, or who are the abrar, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions? It's translated in this translation that I have in front of me as pious. Otherwise it's translated as righteous. Someone who does bir, or is from amongst the abrar, according to commentators of the Holy Quran and of language, they state that someone who does good without hoping for any return. When we do something for someone else without the desire for any return on the way back. That's really, really hard. Whenever I do a favor for someone, I'm immediately expecting that someone is going to return back that favor, or at least I've created, right, the opportunity for me to call back that favor when I need it. Make sense? We do that a lot. I do this for you, but one day I'll get it back from you, One day, you'll pay me back for it. Or that we have a sense of power or authority over the person that we did that favor for. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not say that those who do good, they get to drink out of this drink, meaning that they get satiated in paradise. But rather, that is reserved for the abrar, those who did not want anything in return. They did good for goodness' sake. There's this anecdote, it's pretty funny. It says that one day there was this butcher, and he was in his butchery shop, and he was like cutting chicken and whatever, and as he is about to like cut this chicken, somebody comes from the street and opens the door and says, "Hey butcher, be careful you don't cut off your thumb." So he says, "Thank you for your advice. I know what I'm doing. I'm butcher. I know I got this." The next day, this guy is working in his shop and he's cutting these chickens, and that same guy who came on the street and told him, "Careful of your thumb," he comes with one of his friends and he opens the door and he says, "Hey, friend of mine, that's the guy yesterday, I saved him from cutting off his thumb," right? The next day, and the butcher says, "Yeah, thank you so much for saving my thumb," as if I don't know what I'm doing, right? The next day he comes with his whole entire family, and they walk into the butchery shop and he's telling his whole entire family, "Hey, I helped that butcher not cut off his thumb." And the butcher says, "Yes, thank you so much," as if I didn't know what I was doing. "Get out of my shop," right? The next day he comes with this entire tribe, right? And they walk into the store, and the guy says, "Look, that's the guy, I saved him from cutting off his thumb." The butcher got so upset, he cut off his finger and he threw it to him. He says, take the thumb, you didn't help me do anything," right? In other words, right, it's not a real story, but what's like the lesson that we can extract from it is that many a times when you do something for somebody, we love to throw it in their faces all the time, right? And sometimes it wasn't even that meaningful, right? It was not even that meaningful. And it's worse for the one to be on the recipient end of the one who actually received the favor, if we're going to be a people who is always reminding them that we did something good for them. You follow what I'm saying? The abrar, innal abrara yashrabuna min ka'sin kana mizajuha kafura. Those who are of this highest, most righteous, most pious state, they are the believers who they don't do anything except for the purpose of seeking closeness and proximity and the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've been talking about these laws of prayers before our halaqah every Thursday for those of you who come on time. It'd be good if you participated by coming on time. And we spend about 10 or 15 minutes every Thursday and we run through some of these laws of prayers. Next week, inshallah, we'll talk about niyyah, this intention that we need to have. And what is the intention that is an obligation, which again is an obligation of every ritualistic practice that we perform within our tradition? If someone is not intending, it invalidates their deed. If I have an intention that's different than I'm performing these prayers qurbatan ila Allah, to seek proximity and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my prayer is void. If I fast during the holy month of Ramadan with the intention that I'm fasting because intermittent fasting is good for me, right? That invalidates my fast and I have to make up my fast at a later time. If I'm going for Hajj because of X reason that's distant from my fulfillment of my religious duty to seek proximity and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my Hajj is not valid, right? This foundational sort of prerequisite of every single ritual that we perform is niyyah, is intentionality, and is the niyyah of qurba, that I'm seeking proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In its most pure, in its most unadulterated, in its most sincere form, is to be known as amongst the abrar. Innal abrara yashrabuna min ka'sin mizajuha kafura. Indeed, those who are amongst the abrar, they will drink from this drink that will satiate their thirst. عينا يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا. And they will drink out of the spring that is reserved only for the servants of Allah. And the spring will be gushing out in this really beautiful way, again satiating their thirst. Some of the mufassirin, perhaps from a deduction of the ahadith of the Prophet and his family, state that in paradise, it's not solely that we're attaining this materialistic reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but via the reward, we're also satiating that innate, intrinsic, spiritual desire, which is again to increase our knowledge, our ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Learning and growing never ends, right? It's never meant to end. And in paradise, there are different stages that we also go through. Every day, we want to increase our understanding, our knowledge, who we are as a person, to become better than who we were yesterday. And even if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His grace and out of His mercy and out of His compassion, He grants us paradise. It does not suffice that at that moment that all of a sudden now we know Allah in the way that He ought to be known. Is that for, how can I compare myself toward the Prophet or toward Ali or to Fatima or Hassan or Hussein? Alayhim salam. I cannot. Their knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, due to their exertion and due to their focus and due to their diligence in this dunya, allow for them to be well ahead of schedule, right? In terms of their fulfillment of their duty in comparison with me. And similarly, they themselves will also continue to increase in their knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the world beyond this one. Meaning there's no end. And that's not a bad thing, it's a beautiful thing. We're always consistently growing. You know, sometimes people, they wonder, oh, thank you so much. Is that for us?
Yeah, she was going to throw it out if I didn't find a way to use it, so.
How generous are you?
No problem.
Thank you. That, imagine, actually somebody asked this before. They said, you know, what happens when I go to paradise and I have this food and I have this drink and I have this home and I have, you know, this trees and these gardens and like all these awesome things. I'm going to get bored of them, you know? Like, eventually I'm going to get bored. I want something new, you know? Over here, you know, first of all, like our simplistic mind, right? Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, like, you know, you will have the capacity to whatever you wish it becomes true. Whatever you desire to eat, you will eat. Whatever you desire to drink, you will drink. Wherever you desire to live, you will live. However you want to decorate your home, it will get decorated that way, right? Our simplistic mind is, oh, I'm going to get bored in paradise, right? Like that's the way that we think. That is the way that we think. Anyhow, over here, you want to understand that there's no such thing as boredom in that world beyond this one, because the believer who has attained paradise, they're not concerned with the materialistic pleasure even in that world. They get it and they receive it. And that's wonderful, and we deserve it. We deserve a lot of nice things in this dunya too. It's all good. But at the end of the day, that which will bring us satisfaction is consistently increasing that knowledge and that ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That fulfillment of heart that we get during the month of Ramadan, due to our prayers and due to our worship and due to our focus during the course of those days, they fill this heart in a way that even though we're hungry and even though that we're tired and even though that we're thirsty and whatever it might be, we feel different. And that feeling, we want it to continue on after the month of Ramadan. And we know it doesn't, and it's really, really hard. But we want to go back to that, but we also want to eat and we want to drink, right? And we also want to have coffee. And we also don't want to be fulfilled our schedules with all of these other communal obligations or familial obligations or whatever it might be, right? So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, that innate desire that you have to be guided, that innate desire that you have to be fulfilled, that innate desire that you have to feel satiated, not physically but spiritually, you'll get the physical. All of it. Every one of it. And you won't desire anything else. In this world, the reason why we fall distant from our spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what? Is dunya, right? After the month of Ramadan, we fall off. Why? Because now we're so reconnected with all of the physical. And we're thinking about work, and we're thinking about money, and we're thinking about finance, and we're thinking about relationships, and we're thinking about everything else. Now imagine if all of those distractions were fulfilled. You wanted to drive a new car, you got a new car. You wanted to live in a fancier home, you live in a fancier home. You wanted to be able to afford this really expensive steak, well, the steak came in front of you, right? You don't have any of those distractions anymore. So what else is there in life? Now you can put all of your effort and your attention toward that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is immediately calling you toward, which is to increase your knowledge and understanding of Him. So when we talk about that, the believers, the abrar, those who are righteous, those who are pious, that they will be drinking from the spring, it's not only a fulfillment of a physical drink or a physical food, but it's also that they are recipients of that knowledge that we're consistently seeking, that ma'rifah, that deep spiritual connection that we're seeking, and that opportunity to drink from there and to take knowledge from there, to take insight from there, is present in front of us. But of course, none of that and receiving that is not easy. There are important prerequisites that we need to fulfill. So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, Innal abrar. He states that the abrar are those who get all of these things. But then in these next ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about who they are and what are their characteristics so that we're able to be a recipient of that. He states, for instance, and I'll just go back to this example of examination like we said before. Imagine, for instance, your, instructor says, your manager tells you that if you get an A in this class, you are guaranteed to get this job, and you are guaranteed to get this salary, and you are guaranteed to get this bonus, and you are guaranteed to get this car, and to live in this neighborhood, and to whatever, right? You're like, oh, this is like a great thing. Like, all I have to do is get an A. He's like, okay, now wait a minute. Now let me tell you how you need to get that A, right? And these are all of the fulfillments, and these are all the preconditions, so that you get to that, A in that paper, whatever, right? Over here now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us what those conditions are. He states, Yufuna bin nadri, in ayah number 7. Yufuna bin nadri, wa yakhafuna yawman kana sharruhu mustatira. He states, number 1, they fulfill their vows. We touched on this very briefly last week. They fulfill their vows. They fulfill their responsibilities. On one end, the fulfillment of vows is like on a very physical, tangible, manner. That I promise you that I am going to do X and Y and Z, and so I do X and Y and Z. Mustafa promised me Dave's hot chicken sandwich and Chobani coffee yogurt. I still haven't gotten either of them, right? So you're not from the Abrar, and I don't know how you're going to get all these benefits. Messing with you. Yufuna bin nadri, to fulfill their vows and to fulfill one's promises. But it does not only mean to others in the way that we make a claim or that we make a promise to others, but it's also a fulfillment of a vow that we've made with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. God, if you recall, a few weeks ago, we talked about in verse number 2, or verse number 3, of this chapter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, Inna hadaynahu sabila imma shakiran wa imma kafura. That indeed we have guided the human being to the way, whether he or she be grateful or ungrateful, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guided us. Now it's up to us to execute that guidance that we have been created with. We talk about guidance in 2 forms. Guidance via the innate nature known as the fitrah, or the guide in addition to the guidance of the prophets and the books and the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that consistently surround us. Guidance is there, it's prevalent, it's present in front of us. It's up to us to execute utilizing the roadmap that we've been given. Now in this verse he states, Yufuna bin nadr, those who fulfill their promise. Their promise of what? Not only their promise to each other, but in addition to that, their promise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. God has guided us, we have accepted that guidance, we have accepted that responsibility, but many of us, we don't fulfill or carry out or execute the task that we've been given. وَيَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِرًا. He continues and he states, and in addition to that, not only do they fulfill their vows, but number 2, they fear that day. They fear that day, يَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِرًا, in which ill will be widespread. Meaning that they fear the day of judgment. What does it mean to fear the day of judgment? We talked about this again in passing last week. That to fear the day of judgment means to fear accountability, means to fear our own sins, means to fear our own slip-ups and our own transgressions, means to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He is the one of all might and of all authority. And it does not suffice that we cling on to God's mercy and assume that we will be forgiven and assume that we'll be recipients of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any sense of fear. And then he continues and he states, and amongst their qualities, which qualities? The qualities of the abrar, the righteous, those who do without any expectation in return. وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. And they give food. They give out of themselves, out of their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. To the needy and to the orphan and to the prisoner. And they state, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا. And they will say that, oh Allah, we only feed for your sake. We do not want any reward from you, nor do we want any thanks from anyone. We only do this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Going to verse number 8, he states again, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ, that they give or they feed others out of their love for him. And then in the second verse, God states in verse number 9, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, that they only feed for the sake of God. What does it mean to feed for out of God's love? And what does it mean to feed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We'll talk about that in detail next week, inshaAllah ta'ala. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at icnyu.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.